another edition of the Red Pill Diaries. I'm your host, Rashid, and we'd like to thank each and every one of you for joining us, those who are joining us now and those who will try to join us later. I got a special guest in the booth. I got to bring him in, my guy, Matthew Ehret. Let me see if they'll bring you in without any problems. How's it going today, my guy?
Hey, how's it going, Rashid? I'm doing good. Thank you.
All right. For the people who may not know anything about you, could you please tell them just a little bit about you and what you do for a living and yeah, just go from there.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, there are a few hats that I wear, but I've written a few books on the Clash of the Two Americas, volume 1 to 4, four volumes also on the reconstruction of Canadian history, on the untold history of Canada. So I do sort of get called a bit of a historian, and but overall, most of what I do tends to be from a geopolitical analysis standpoint. So I write for a few platforms like The Cradle, The Last American Vagabond. I set up my own geopolitical analysis website back in 2012 called the Canadian Patriot. People can check that out. Also, co-founded the Rising Tide Foundation, a nonprofit focused on education, intercultural dialogue, with my wife, who also is a co-author of some of the books. And I'm a senior fellow at the American University of Moscow with Dr. Edward Lazansky. That's a few things. So, I try to bring it all together as much as I can.
Hey, that's more than a few things. I got my sage blowing in the background to get out all of the negative energy. Now,
I thought you had some toast burning or something. I wasn't sure. Okay.
I often have my sage. So the wind, because I have the window open, because I have to check out on the chickens. I have chickens out here, right? And so I have to check out the chickens, make sure no predators out there. I have the window in this office area up, and I have the sage blowing at the same time and the fan blowing. So I just want to go into what do you make of this situation now in Ukraine, and does it look like the West is beginning to drop Zelensky and their narrative? Because for the first time in the news, they're talking about Ukraine can't win. For the first time in the news, in the mainstream news, They're talking about it's Zelensky's fault. Zelensky is blaming the West. The West is blaming Zelensky. So where are we at in this stage of this war brought upon Russia by the Western world?
Yeah, I think you're making a very good point in that it appears that a little bit of reality is cracking through the skulls of some of the geopolitical ivory tower grand strategists who had a very different idea of reality in their fictitious imaginary world that they thought they were living in. And now that they've put certain things into motion, they're finding that reality is not what they wanted to believe it was or demanded that it was. We already saw some signs of dissent, cracks within the machine already at the end of last year, when I think it was the Washington Post, I want to say, even circulated a piece of intelligence casting the blame away from, this is right after the Seymour Hersh report that went viral. I forget which month it was. Was it November, December of 2022? I forget. Maybe. Anyway, and this Seymour Hersh report was obviously disastrous for the U.S. propaganda machine, because it did make the point, using a lot of hardcore evidence and insider information, that the U.S. military was, or at least a very powerful grouping within the Pentagon, within the U.S. military establishment, was actually coordinating behind the scenes to destroy Nord Stream 2. And they basically, something within the U.S. establishment tried to circulate the idea that, okay, maybe it wasn't the Russians, but it was probably Zelensky and the Ukrainians. And you're like, well, right there, that's a bit weird, because up until now, you've been trying to celebrate this thing as if it's better than Lincoln. Zelensky, like the new Lincoln times 10. So there was obviously some dissent about the narrative not working, and how do you take back control of the narrative. But like you said, it's amplified over the past few weeks, with what appears to be an effort to try to change course. Now, the difficulty here, well, Ukraine is a disaster. I think conservative estimates have it at least 350,000 Ukrainians have died. It might be upwards of 400,000. Easily, far outnumbering. It's like one Russian death has occurred with every 10 Ukrainian deaths or more. 70,000 young men in Ukraine have lost their limbs. The population went from 40 million down to something like 17 million people. Like, they've lost more than half of their people. The whole thing is a basket case. It's not working. None of their offensives work. So I think the difficulty is they've put so much effort into this machinery of public opinion and policy that is very difficult to steer it in another direction. But I think we're seeing an effort to try to do so by trying to call for like an off-ramp of some sort for the Russians, they say, to try to save face, that we have to give the Russians an off-ramp and give them a chance to breathe. So maybe we should figure out a way to come to the negotiating table. But I think that the recognition that that U.S. military resources are going to have to be allocated towards the China threat more than what's currently being done in Ukraine against Russia. That's one thing. But then also I've noticed people like Jeffrey Sachs, representing. I don't trust Jeffrey Sachs. I know a lot of people like him. They say he made simply mistakes. He didn't know what he was doing in the 90s. I don't believe that. I think Jeffrey Sachs is a very high level player, very, very sophisticated operator, who did know exactly what he was doing in the 90s. And I think he represents simply a much more rational component within the oligarchy, that faction that recognizes it is not in their interest to unleash nuclear war, and they would rather live to fight another day. And so he's been deployed, I believe, through an assignment to be the rational, respectful voice that can recognize the problems of Chinese and Russian leaders and try to bring some trust back into the fold, so that that oligarchy which he is devoted to will be able to perhaps get close to and then subvert the multipolar alliance in the future. But that's a whole other conversation there. So anyway, yeah, I think you're right, though.
But how this is the conundrum here. They appear to want to offer an off-ramp to Russia, but according to their demands, dictates, and according to their policies, when they are losing at every turn, how can you offer an off-ramp to the victor when you're getting smashed on the battlefield, you're getting smashed in the political arena, and you're getting smashed economically? Everything that you tried to do to them, it boomeranged back. Russia has become the largest economy in Europe, according to all statistics now. So the sanctions have proven to not only not work, but have been detrimental and deadly even to the nations that implemented those sanctions. So how can you offer an off-ramp to a victorious nation and demand that they cede so many things in order to receive an off-ramp from a loser?
Rashid, I wish I had a full answer to that very clear, simple question you have, because it is a wonderful, simple question. And I mean, this, because people often, I've noticed, when they're trying to analyze the planning and the methods of oligarchical manipulation, past or present, they tend to fall into one of two camps of either attributing the agency, the causal agency of action, those planning groups that try to orchestrate assassinations, coups d'etats, wars throughout all of our history, as being either simply motivated by some combination of corruption and stupidity, or inversely, absolute genius, brilliance, almost godlike powers of foresight and power of action. And I don't think either one is really correct, but I don't think either one is false either. I think that it's not exclusive one or the other. I think there's an element of brilliance in this force of evil that is represented by these leading families and some of their auxiliaries within the British Royal Society, Cambridge Chatham House, some of these inner core think tanks. There is a level of sophistication and brilliance that has to be almost respected in a disgusting way. But at the same time, there's a level of stupid that's also infused into the mix, based on arrogance and a tendency to self-perceive as if they themselves were the gods they wish to project outwards to their victims. They want us to think of them as the gods of Egypt, who are immortal and thus slave don't bother trying to rise up because you're dealing with immortal gods. You know, like you can't just know your place. That's how they would like that type of imagery to be projected. But then they kind of start believing it sometimes. And I think they start believing in their own immutability. So that causes them to historically fuck up. And I don't know if I'm allowed to use that language.
Oh, yes.
Sorry. Okay.
Yes.
But I'll generally try to tone it down for family-friendly purposes. But I do find that looking at history, there are these situations that I see as paralleling what's going on today, where when it comes down to crunch time, they're very good at planning, and the art. They have there's a certain awareness of how to manipulate the zeitgeist, mass mental behavior, herd behavior. There's things that you learn when you're brought into some of the higher up, like if you're a Cambridge apostle, like Bertrand Russell or John Maynard Keynes or any of these figures. You don't learn what a community college student in LA learns. You know, you're going to be learning a different anthropology, a different history, a different set of appreciations for real factors of the mind that you have to be aware of if you are going to be a manager of the empire in continuity over, you know, when you go out of the university and into life. To be trusted, you have to know these things, but you have to also have compromised something human within yourself along the way, which is, I think, what many Rhodes Scholars, unfortunately, go through before they're processed in Oxford and then resent back to become, you know, Strobe Talbot or Bill Clinton or any of the freaks, you know, managing Biden, like Jake Sullivan, Rhodes Scholar, or Susan Rice, or any of these creeps. So something has to be broken for them to have access to that broader spectrum of knowledge. Now, when it comes down to crunch time of action, what looked good in the planning stages on the whiteboard, all of a sudden they tend to screw up a lot. And I saw that you could see that with the rise of the Hitler machine. You know, Hitler would not have been a factor in anything had it not been. He was a fringe grouping in the 1920s in Germany. Nobody in Germany really took this guy seriously, or the Nazi fringe group that he represented. So how did he become what he became? Well, it was without the patronage and support of the Rockefeller Foundation, of the J.P. Morgan Trust, of the DuPonts, of the Montague Norman Bank of England machine, of the Rockefeller Standard Oil Petroleum Corporate, which was like providing all the oil needs to the Nazi machine before and during and after Operation Barbarossa, right? If it weren't for that, there would not have been a Nazi problem, you know? So why did they stop? Why is it at a certain point, all of these operatives and agencies who put so much effort into the cultivation of their fascist enforcer, Mussolini had a very similar story. The Japanese fascists were very much shaped by British foreign policy gurus and British militarists who were assisting them in building up their giant war machine from the end of the Sino-Japanese War of 1894. The Japanese were already being cultivated to be a fascist war machine, and they'd been profiled, you know, based on their sort of samurai feudal legacy that was amplified by those advisors from London who were sent down to cultivate this thing, to use it when it became expedient. So why did they have to abort that? Well, they aborted that because it looked good on paper. Everything was supposed to work. And then Hitler all of a sudden started listening to his generals and realizing, well, hey, I've got this giant war machine, this giant arsenal that's been curated for me, built up with the support of British foreign policy that helped me take control of Czechoslovakia, that increasingly helped me take control easily of Poland. That was with British back-channel diplomacy and advisors the whole time, making sure that was successful. Alex Craner did a wonderful deep dive into that story. But then all of a sudden he's like, well, Hitler said, or came to the conclusion that I can be the senior partner. I don't have to be the junior partner of a new world order. I could be the senior, and Britain can abide by my desires. They could be my junior partner. And yeah, they'll get jurisdictional controls of India and different parts of the world, but I can be the top dog. And some British grand strategists were okay with that. Lloyd George and Neville Chamberlain and the factions they represent were okay. They were like, okay, let's just, you know, roll with the punches. You know, we put all this effort into it. Let's just do it. And then others like Leo Amory and Churchill they weren't good, but they were a little bit more able to recognize that this was not in their own self-interest, and that they would be stripped of a lot of the power that they thought that they deserved. And there was a giant faction fight, a hectic, fearful faction fight over what would be the foreign policy of Britain. The Churchill groupings ended up winning out, but they created a mess, a total mess, that forced them to go in and have to abort their project to live to fight another day. And then try to create new narratives. That only kind of addresses what you said, because what you said is something similar but different, because they're actually at a place right now where I think some of what they're saying about wanting to create an off-ramp for Russia is based on the need to create stories to account for why things happened for the future. Like the oligarchy thinks about the future more than your average Joe who's like that we meet and live with day to day. Like, for example, as soon as January 6th happened, you immediately on January 9th, you had a team of historians deployed to Washington from Chatham House, London. That's the mothership of the mothership. What Hillary Clinton calls the CFR as the mothership. The CFR is the American branch of the mothership Chatham House, the Royal Institute for International Affairs. That's the Cecil Rhodes Milner Roundtable group that set this thing up in 1919 and had their American branch always. They had a Canadian and Australian and New Zealand and South African branch too to coordinate grand strategy. They sent a team of historians to America with the explicit purpose of setting the record straight over how what happened on January 6th was worse than the Civil War. And they began to put this to work. So even though today we're a little bit closer to that action from a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, they're thinking about, so we can see some of the, like, where the fraud is located in that whole event. Whereas these groupings are trying to create a narrative, a story for what future children who are like babies now will be learning about this thing that happened that's worse than the Civil War. So they create stories for the future. And I think that that's partially what they're doing now, is setting the stage for the messaging for what history books and narrative makers, myth makers will be saying about what happened in Ukraine. Though I think that it's likely that it is understood even by those putting that out that the ultimate size of Ukraine is going to get very small in reality, whether, that's going to involve some of the Polish coming out, who are slobbering, drooling at the chops to get control of their historic, right to control Galicia and some West Ukrainian territories, and I don't think that I think it's much more better understood by those who actually make decisions, even on the wrong side of this game, that those territories of Crimea and Donbass are not going back to Ukraine. I think that it's recognized, I believe, that they screwed up. But it's taking a while to actually get to some decision-making process. Because, again, they're so enmeshed in it. They've committed so much to this game and this agenda that they can't just go and they can't say we fucked up, or they can't say that the Zelensky plan for, putting Putin at the ICC for war crimes and kicking him out and asking for an apology. They can't say that that's a bad idea, but they know it's not going to work. So they're going through the steps, I think. They're going through some motions while actually preparing the groundwork for a reshifting, probably with a focus on burning, trying to set Belarus on fire, Hungary on fire, with other NED, other types of operations that, Samantha Powers was deployed to sort of go to Hungary not that long ago and reactivate or re-coordinate some of the NED-funded human rights organizations that are covers for mass chaos operations, like from the Maidan. That's what they would like to do. Of course, even that's being preemptively reacted to by Wagner showing up all of a sudden in Belarus as a preemptive action there to make sure that there's as much stability there. I think Bosnia is obviously under attack. Not attack, but I mean the whole Bosnia region is being reactivated to be part of the chess piece again to light a region on fire. But also, like I said, Indochina is a big one. So they're also looking at shifting their forces much more seriously into the Indo-Chinese region, as well, with Taiwan and Japan going through some weird stuff.
And Thailand.
Thailand, yeah, they're lighting fires there too. Yep.
Yeah. Do you think that the leadership, and I'm talking about the top leadership and those like right up under the top leadership, do you think that they have become a prisoner to their own propaganda, and they see the handwriting on the wall, but because they've been in a position of power so long, it is going to take a knock on the head or a kick in the behind to force them to acknowledge that they are losing, they have lost, and that they have to regroup and have a new perspective on the way this new paradigm, this new global paradigm that is underway.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they drink their own Kool-Aid. They yeah, a lot. And no, you're right. They will definitely need reality to cause them a bit of pain, I think, before they're able to. I mean, I don't know to what degree the because there's layers of decision making in the machine. There's the auxiliaries, there's the higher auxiliaries, there's the actual agencies who make the planning. Very few are in that level of initiation in the know. Some of these things were put on into motion over a century ago. Like as far as like a general broad template, it doesn't mean that everything has worked according to the plan for a century. A lot of things have gone wrong, and but the general outline people need to read if they want to look at how to understand the general battle plan, the blueprint. They got to go back to some of the remarks or the writings that were published by people like George Parkin, a Canadian who is in charge of the Rose Trust, who trained and wrote a book in 18 called Imperial Federation. And he goes through exactly the crisis of the global British Empire in the 1880s, 1890s, faced with the growth of national sovereign economic programs of development that were spreading like a wildfire. In Russia, in Japan, in China, the Meiji Restoration was bringing in. You had Lincoln advisors who were working with Henry C. Carey, Lincoln's top advisor, who were deployed down to Japan to advise the restoration of the Meiji Emperor. But based upon what America was doing as a very different set of advice than what we saw from the British advisors who were also being deployed down there, where the Americans were saying, well, use a national bank like that which was used as in principle in America, but what Lincoln did with the greenbacks. They're like, use that to fund the development of railways. In America, Philadelphia railway companies were producing rail cars that they were sending to Japan to help build rail, to use protective tariffs to block the dumping of British cheap goods. Russia was doing the same thing with the Trans-Siberian Railway. Again, advised by American engineers and economists who were on the ground working with Alexander II and the Third and Zergevita to bring in the American system of political economic programming, which is very different from British free trade speculation money worship. It was totally different. They call both capitalism today, and that's part of the big fraud of why we're so confused by our own past, is because it's been over the word capitalism has become so simplistically comprehensive that everything which was done before the age of communism of the 20th century is all grouped in the same basket, different species of British capitalism. Lincoln, Hamilton, Roosevelt, it's all just British economics. No, it's not true. That was a very different system. And as George Parkin writes in his Imperial Federation, The Crisis of Empire, is that if nations learn that they have the right to issue their own productive credit for the carving out of their own destiny through the built by liberating themselves from dependency upon British shipping lanes, because Britain was only able to control the world by having control of the key choke points. By controlling 8 or 9 choke points of maritime traffic, like in Malacca or the Suez Canal region, or where you go into the Red Sea or the Cape of Good Hope, you're able to control the world. You don't have to control everything; you just control those choke points. But that means that nobody is allowed to develop their inland powers. They can't. And if you do have rail anywhere, like what Britain did to Africa, it has to be done in such a manner that only the private corporations like the British East India Company or the Belgians or the French companies control the railways. You make sure that it doesn't benefit the people, but it only goes from the mine to the port, so that you could extract the loot and send it back to the homeland. And you make sure that none of the rail gauges are compatible, so that at no point would the Africans ever have the power of building up some integrated system of solidarity. That was by design, despite the fact that you could make more money out of that. If you actually help the poor nations of the world develop and modernize, that would be more profitable for the capitalist who was participating in that. So it shows you that it's actually not about capitalism. It's not about making money. There's something more insidious bubbling under the agenda in the surface, right? So George Parkin put forth a whole thing on how to create a new global world empire to save the British Empire under a new form. It needs to be repackaged. Cecil Rhodes played a key role in laying out the strategy in his wills. People need to read his 1877 last wills and testament. It serves as a manifesto for what became the Rhodes scholarship system, the Rhodes Trust, the Roundtable movements, the CFR, all of that stuff that shaped and perverted so much. Every single war, in fact, of the 20th century cannot be explained unless you understand the role of these Rhodes Scholar zombies deployed, planning out on the U.S. side, infiltrating the U.S. government, working very closely with the Fabian Society, where one operates through Oxford, the other one operates through the London School of Economics, but both closely work together. So there is a fabric around this. H.G. Wells, look at his Open Conspiracy from what is it, like 1930? Or Bertrand Russell, read his 1930 this A Scientific Outlook. They just say what they're going to do. It's all in there. Or H.G. Wells, both of them, Russell and Wells, were both Fabians. They say what they're going to do and why they're going to do it, but they expect people to not put words and actions together. But they create a general blueprint of what do they all want? They want one world government. They want to reduce the world population. They want to create new religious systems that are more controllable by a new secular priest class. They recognize, especially people like Aldous Huxley really pioneers this, and the work on MK Ultra advances this even further. Aleister Crowley plays a big role in this, in his work on mescaline, on how do you use drugs, narcotics, by investigating how this was done in the ancient times during the rites of initiation of the mystery religions of the cults of Eleusis of Delphi. So they study deep history, and they know how these inductions work and how ancient forms of, they study how ancient forms of mushrooms or like today's psilocybines were used in different cultures or in ancient rites of initiation, or the plant blight or the wheat blight that used to grow off of wheat when it would get sick. That is a hallucinogenic. That's the root of the modern LSD 25, shaped by Albert Hofmann and working for MK Ultra and Sidney Gottlieb and these. So they're all studying ancient techniques of systems of control, trying to figure out how do they repackage that for the modern day. People like, again, H.G. Wells, all of these creatures I just mentioned, they talk about the need to create new synthetic religions to unite and manage the reduced human population in a new system where we are obedient, where we're vicious, we lose the love of our children, we lose the love of our grandparents, we become very atomized. They want that. And they want to figure out a religion that can masquerade around a virtue of selfishness, that gives people the sense that that's actually my virtue, is actually what makes me petty and selfish. They've thought about that. Does it work? Well, kind of yes and kind of no, because at different times they don't account for in their system a Martin Luther King Jr. They don't account for a John F. Kennedy, a Lumumba. It doesn't exist in their system. Human beings are supposed to be these programmable robots, right? That are like a mix of like vicious animal mixed with robot. You could kind of like train, program with behaviorist techniques. But then occasionally you have virtuous people who break profile and who do things that no robot or animal would do, that inspires other people, that completely breaks the program. And then they have to, then the oligarchy has to either suffer from their own screw up, where they underestimated something in the players they wanted to use for their benefit, end up blowing up in their face, or human beings who are not supposed to be human end up emerging, like John F. Kennedy from a mafia supporting family, or a family that's deeply enmeshed with the mafia. Joe Kennedy doesn't seem to be a good guy. He was, American ambassador to Britain, loved the British aristocratic way of life, but his kids, well, at least Robert and John, turned out to be really solid people who broke with the family profile and ended up working with like-minded people in the Pan-African movement in South America that they were able to see eye to eye with and recognize a common enemy and figure out a way to beat that thing. And they did some amazing things that the oligarchy's been working for like 60 years since they murdered JFK to try to put some of the stuff back in the bottle. It's taken them a long time to undo the mess JFK made for them, this long later. So, there's again a bit of mix of corruption and stupidity, but also a little bit of mix of genius. All together, it coexists within imperial modus operandi that I can identify so far, and I think we're seeing a big demonstration of that, because partially the oligarchy has been living in a world, like you said, of arrogance. They've been enjoying the prestige of unchallenged dominance for many decades now. And those who were the more sharp thinkers, the Henry Kissingers, who are a little bit more rigorous and disciplined in their thoughts, or obviously even smarter than him is Bertrand Russell, H.G. Wells earlier on. But those who were actually rigorous thinkers are either over 100 years old or long dead. And the current batch that I could see of heirs to this legacy are much more mediocre in their quality of thinking, much more presumptuous, much more lazy, as well, and in some ways much more touched by the very cultural sphere of mediocrity that was generated to make the plebes stupid and malleable. There's a whole artificial culture that was created by the CIA, by MI6, to make us all more pliable. But that it's very seductive, these cultural aspects. The video game culture that Prince Harry is a video game addict. The drug and music degeneracy that is out there. It touches their own kids, and their own kids end up getting affected by this. Like the Rothschild children, there's stories you've seen of like some of the drug-laced orgy parties on yachts that these kids are going through. That speaks of a lack of discipline, of their own self-control. That's not somebody who's capable of managing something as multi-layered and sophisticated as a world empire needs to be managed. No, you can't be that kind of person. Or look at Biden, like the auxiliaries that they need to put things in motion, like Biden or Justin Trudeau. They need people like that, or Ursula von der Leyen's to make things happen. These are the dumbest people in the world. So that gives me, I think, a little bit of hope. I would hope it gives everybody a little bit of hope that they're dumb and predictable in some ways, albeit vicious in others. Yeah.
I want to touch on a few things because I want to transition to the Niger crisis and what's going on over there, and the instigators and the people who have benefited from the exploitation of resource-rich lands. But I want to go to something first, because I hear this line of thinking on almost all of the alternative media sites. Excuse me. When we talk about these situations, they seem oblivious to the core issues of why Europe or European nations are dealing with a cultural crisis, with an influx of migrants that will not assimilate. They seem like they are oblivious to the reason that these people fled their homeland to Europe, and they seem like they're dismissive of Europe's main part in this, because I hear them talking about, and this is something, and this is no knock to Colonel McGregor, but I hear him talk a lot about growing crime, in which there's a lot of growing crime. And I hear him talking about the migrants, the Muslims, and everybody don't want to assimilate in in Europe. But I never hear him talk about the reason why. And we know that it is European nations that are in these countries occupied and siphoning off resources. And then when vibrant, viable leaders pop up on the scene, they assassinate them, they overthrow them, they imprison them, or they just make war with them and bomb the nations back to the Stone Age. And this is the cause of the anger by these migrants that are fleeing to the very nations that destroyed their institutions of government. And these migrants who are angry when they come to that society, And also on top of that, they never talk about the brutality that caused the situation. Why is alternative media not addressing and refusing to address the underlying causes of the influx of migrants from the Middle East and North Africa into Europe? And it seems like these are the alternative media. It seems like these are the most learned and most skilled people, and yet it seems like it has to be a willful act of ignorance to not address the main causes of these situations. What is on your mind? What do you say about that?
Yeah, it's frustrating. I think that you're touching on an issue, I think, of epistemology partially, and partially emotional maturity, which is it's lacking, I think, in some quarters of those who do offer good value in their analysis of the world, but at the same time have these weird blind spots. I mean, you could say the same thing for, like, some people are shocked to hear some of the remarks made by Bobby Kennedy on Israel, and for somebody who has been so solid, Bobby Kennedy Jr., somebody who had been so solid on so many points that matter, to be so off to that degree of extreme is jarring. It's jarring to hear things like that. Mearsheimer as well, like he speaks quite, he's like a breath of fresh air. But at the same time, when you hear him speak about China or anything, it's like, what are you doing? What are you saying? Sometimes it sounds almost neocon-esque. So okay, so partly I think that there's a battle of the mind and the battle of the institutions that shape the mind that goes back many generations. I alluded to some of that stuff in my previous remarks. If you could get people, Plato wrote a very important document called The Republic. In book 7, within the Republic, there's the famous allegory of the cave. And Plato was making explicit something that was never meant to be said aloud. He was basically showcasing, making naked and transparent for anyone to read about the structure of imperial controls and the structure of what allows us to remain willfully under the control of said imperial systems, regardless of whether this is in Persia or Babylon or Greece or today's world. It's always the same structure. It's the general template. It's always going to be that way. And so the masses, the majority, will be inclined to believe in the shadows cast on the cave wall as if that was reality, under certain conditions. Amongst those conditions, well, number one is that you have a willful auxiliary class who are allowed to know how the shadow game works and are the ones that Plato describes, holding the puppets, making the sounds, that then those shackled who can only live their lives looking at the cave wall, they believe the sounds, the sights, as if that were real. But then, so you have the masses, you have the auxiliaries controlling the puppets, and the shadow is cast by the light of a flame, a fire, inside of the cave. And then he's got the scenario of somebody, let's say, and he doesn't say how, somebody finds themselves unshackled, notices that there's another light behind them, and they, in perplexity, begin to move towards the light, crawl through and out a little tunnel, and find themselves outside, enjoying actual real light from the sun, not some artificial secondary source. And at first he describes, their impulse is to go back into the cave because it's painful. It's like scary. And I think everybody who's sort of taken the red pill has some sense of that feeling state on some level, right? But he's like, if you're courage, if you're committed to honesty, you will stay outside. You'll learn to train your eyes to look at reality as it is instead of as it appears to be. And then over time, he says this is where the fake self-professed Platonists of the empire, because you'll also notice when I mentioned that people should read H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell and Parkins and Rhodes, you'll notice a theme that they will often refer to themselves as guardians or Platonists. Because Plato in the book, he's thinking, like, the whole point of the Republic is it's a thought experiment and testing different hypotheses about how a society that is capable of justice would would be able to be created and how the leaders of that society, called the guardians, would be trained. So he's basically looking at different hypotheses, testing them out, and seeing where his hypotheses falls short, using certain elements of like the Spartan model or other things that existed in his time. And people will tend to read his writings, as the oligarchy does, as a literal guideline of what do we do as the shadow controllers to keep the people in the cave. That's what they'll do. They'll be literalists. Now with Plato, anybody who's read Plato's dialogues know that the guy's hilarious. He's ironic. He's a truth. He's like a Promethean truth lover. And this is the point of divergence. They will use that template to figure out how do you better find techniques that advance over the eons. It's been 2,000 plus years ago that Plato wrote that. So some of the techniques have been more refined of keeping people in the cave. How do you control academic ideas? What types of methods of thinking are going to be promoted that will then shape the minds of the masses as well as of the elites and the elites of the elites that need to think a certain way in order to believe that their senses or the shadows are real. But they don't like the last part of what Plato says through the mouth of Socrates in the dialogue, which is the true philosopher is not somebody who remains outside of the cave or simply uses his knowledge of reality in order to better shape the masses inside the cave. He says the true philosopher, that is the lover of Sophia, the lover of truth, not just the sophist, but the real philosopher is somebody who goes back into the cave at risk of their own death in order to help others be pulled out of the cave and also discover truth. That's the part that the oligarchy, they stop reading right before that. But that's everything. If you make a discovery, then with that comes with a power with that knowledge, and with that knowledge comes responsibility, not to overquote Peter Parker or Uncle Ben from Spider-Man, but it's true. We're now we have a moral weight that our conscience compels us to use that knowledge in such a manner that we then can be conduits and instruments now of that truth we have discovered and help others thus resist tyranny. And I think people like Patrice Lumumba and others, you're like, how the hell, knowing that you're facing this satanic beast of evil, how would this person have the strength of character to be hilarious? He's funny, he's courageous, he's brilliant. He knows he might likely die, as do so many of these people. They're very self-aware of the risks that they're taking, but they make them anyway because there's something that they value more than their lives. JFK knows that he might die. He might have made some stupid motions as well. I think, like going into Dallas, with your top down thing. That's probably a silly thing. He didn't have to make those mistakes. But the point being is they're all drinking from the same well that Plato is describing, and people, I think today, from the healthy analysts of alternative media, they're products in some ways of the system that they are trying to expose, to change, and there's certain systems, modern ways that have been crafted to keep the minds of those who would be processed through the universities outside of accessing their full potential and reality per se, by giving us a false framework through which we have to use as a method of thinking, like positivism. Positivism is something that was crafted at it came out of the British empiricist school, the British empiricists like David Hume, John Locke, Adam Smith. They're all empiricists. They all believe that knowledge is simply the sum total of sensory accumulation of data that could then be charted, where we then look for patterns in our senses. We then can extrapolate the patterns and call it a law. It's called inductive reasoning. That's the outgrowth of the British empiricist school. Now it got amplified by the positivists of Ernst Mach and some of the positivists of the late 19th century. Bertrand Russell was a big one who promoted that, though he didn't believe in it, but he promoted it. And they said, okay, there is no such thing. True scientific thinking, which has to be applied to political systems, anthropology, sociology, everything has to be scientific thinking. Scientific thinking means we look only at the hard data, and we cannot assume the existence of soul, of God, of justice, of freedom. Anything that you cannot chart or model or weigh or cut up into pieces is not allowed to exist in these types of people who think this way. And they applied this method into how we're allowed to analyze what's going on in the quantum world, in physics, again, in human systems, in economics. Nothing was uncontaminated by this. It's very mechanistic. It presumes that all systems are sort of like machines that can be treated and analyzed like mechanistic machines with just cold forces that can be described and applied by a formula, but not understood why. Like, you can't, like, this is where the whole stupid statement goes, you know, science is understanding the hows of things, but never the why of things. That's insane. The only way science has ever moved forward is by creative people like Plato using a Platonic method of paradox formation and generation of new hypotheses, who are asking, why is something the way it is and not other ways? Without that question, there is no discoveries or revolutions of science. That's been destroyed. And so when you have a lot of really smart people who have been through military academies, Yale conditioning, but they're good people, they still tend to bring in that technique of dissecting world geopolitical events without a proper appreciation for the causal principles that are actually shaping the thing that they're talking about. And so the agency of, like, the oligarchy, how does John Mearsheimer or how does Douglas McGregor think of the oligarchy? Do they have they really worked that through, the techniques and methods of oligarchism? Do they even bring that into their considerations? Or is it just, do they just presume that corruption and stupidity is at the heart of the thing? And how do they think of the issue of soul? Do they think of the soul? Because human beings die for the preservation, the salvation of their soul. Human beings do that. We make things happen like that. Our conscience is not material. And so one of the driving factors of our identities and decision making for good has always been, good conspiracies is matters of humanity, the soul, justice. That's causal. The oligarchy is reactive. They don't make discoveries, but they can try to subvert and like a chameleon, masquerade like you're somebody who loves truth, but do so in such a manner that you're actually subverting the substance of the truth that you're trying to get close to and control the interpretation of it. Hence the British scientists, or the British interpretation of science that's everywhere today, or economics being all about the markets and money. It's everywhere. So I think they're not able to sort of see a full contextual picture of the moving parts together that involve a multidisciplinary aspect, because you can't just look at geopolitics from the standpoint of politics or simply economics or simply history. You have to have sort of an ability of the mind to jump from, to see how all of these are different parts of the same thing. And because they didn't take the time to appreciate that, they misfire on a whole bunch of points that really matter. So that's my thinking on that.
I want to follow that up, but first, a channel member Mehdi says propaganda. He was following up something that you said, and he said propaganda. It is related to neuro-linguistic programming, changing the inner dialogue you have when making moral decisions.
Yeah.
So again, like I listen to some of these guys and their thinking, and they're almost dismissive of the cause of the effect that they're talking about. Like when I heard McGregor talk about the growing violence and the growing savagery of America, it was disconnected from the causes of that. And so many times people give these little, I would say, elementary answers without thought. And when you are a steward for a lot of people, sometimes it takes more than just that quick answer. Sometimes it takes diving into the question to give them a little bit more. So if we talk about the plague of guns in urban America, let's just use that for an example. I often ask the audience, well, if there's a plague of violence and guns in urban America, where did the guns come from? Because there's not one black-owned gun maker in America. Okay, if you can watch Bin Laden in a cave from a satellite, You can't watch the borders for drugs coming over. I mean, think about no one addresses these issues, because I think if they address these issues, it's twofold. If you address the issue, you can get an answer, but you may not get the answer that you were looking for. But how can you correct a wrong with wrong answers? You've got to be able to analyze the situation for what it is, and sometimes put your things that you hold dear to you to the side for further advancement mentally. Let's look at let's go back again to the migrant crisis. Well, first let's stay here at the violence and the drugs, and then they ignored that Richard Nixon had admitted that he would use the influx of drugs and violence in the Black community and play it on the news every night. This is what his top advisor admitted to, and they would use that to dehumanize and then vilify urban America to justify putting them in jail, because they had two enemies: Black America, they said, and I forget the other. I think the hippies or something like that. So they wanted to get rid of both of them, and they would use that. And then if we look at the situation of the influx of migrants in Europe, and because I heard McGregor talk about how they won't assimilate, and how that they are a tremendous economic burden on those European countries. And I'm thinking, okay, that's a no-brainer. Okay, why are they a tremendous economic burden on those economies? Because the nations of those economies destabilize the home front from which the migrants are coming from. They siphoned off the wealth. They put in dictators or corrupt leaders who fleeced the people and the nation. And then when it was no longer beneficial for them, they went in, they bombed or overthrew the government and destroyed the institutions which make viable governments. Why is that left out in the discourse amongst these learned military people and these learned, analysts across not just mainstream, but specifically and especially the so-called alternative media?
Yeah, there's like a certain polite discourse or a certain type of discourse that you are expected to abide by if you want to be published or be invited into polite society in the mainstream sort of world. And I think that there's some sort of a either conscious or in many cases a subconscious bad habits and impulses that shape the strategic thinking of many of the better people who are falling under the category that you're describing, who sort of self castrate their own powers of thinking in order to speak in a language that is acceptable to the class that they thought, when they were perhaps younger and stupider, that they wanted to be a part of and maybe be a leading element within. Now they've been shaken out of some of that stupidity and some of that naivete by life's experiences that kick their asses and force them to become more serious thinkers, but still traces still remain holding them back. The economics is a big one, and I think that people have been really mistrained to totally misdiagnose what the hell economics actually is. We've been given numbers theories, theories on inflation, theories on pricing, commodity speculation, like all sorts of like mechanistic crap that have to do with just basically what it boils down to. The way that they teach modern economics is really through gambling principles extrapolated and given like sort of a veneer of science by having like differential equations associated with them, and you can win Nobel Prizes based on how much like apparent mathematical garbage you can like latch on or put onto what is ultimately a stupid hedonistic theory of economic value that has no bearing in reality. Because what is reality? Reality is like we're there's a certain amount of people on the world at any given time, and those certain amount of people require a certain amount of things to survive and to thrive. And to the degree that your economy is morally wired to ensure that investment behavior is tied to improving the conditions of life of people by building up infrastructure, by ensuring reliable quality jobs, good quality. And the education system will always sort of be shaped or be molded by the quality of economic system you have in place, because you need workers who can be can do the job of what your society is committed to doing. So if you have, a bold, like China and Russia, they got a really bold space program. They're going to be jointly managing a lunar base by 2030 if we can avoid nuclear war. That's the current commitments. That also involves lunar industrialization, lunar mining of helium-3 and other rare earths that are in abundance on the moon. They're as part also a scientific component. So that initiative, that goal, just like the goal that JFK set, has what we have seen is it's forced the entire school systems of China to accommodate, to change their curriculums to produce the quality of people that could then do the job of solving all of these unsolved problems that would make that happen. So now kids really want, and that's also shaping the government's cultural policies to encourage films and shows that glorify space discovery, things like that. It's very optimistic compared to the type of crap where in the West, the same types of fiction stories promoted by our governing agencies showcase space generally from the standpoint of what? It's a place you go to die and get killed by aliens, Space, nobody can hear you scream. So you get all this like very negative imagery where people here in the West, like kids who were surveyed in thousands of schools in North America versus China, were given 10 different jobs that they would like to be. Astronaut and YouTuber were on the list. But it was an inverse list. Whereas in China, all the kids, vast majority, wanted to be astronauts. YouTube superstar was like bottom of the list for the Chinese kids. Whereas in America, it was the very opposite. No kid wanted to be an astronaut. They all wanted to be YouTube stars. So it shows you the different priorities of the economic structure. Now, you don't get radicalization. You don't get much in the way of like terrorism recruitment. You don't get much in the way of organized crime syndicates that can do very much when you have a healthy, robust economy where people actually have alternatives to live in dignity and respect themselves with a mind. If Afghanistan actually had if they were allowed to have a modern economy, well, kids wouldn't take $500 from some CIA cover group to go and like do jihad, right? We wouldn't do it. And the same thing, it's like if you don't have the Wall Street banks laundering, like HSBC Bank was caught under the Carl Levin committee hearings in 2012, having laundered over $100 billion of drug money that Carl Levin proved was also going towards terrorist financing, with narco terrorists of South America, the Middle East, all facilitated to maintain their operations specifically through the patronage of these Wall Street banks that need to launder this money to maintain their bubbles anyway. So what happens to the whole organized narco terrorist syndicates and all of this stuff across the world if Wall Street is removed from having the power of doing that? Well, you choke their supply lines, right? Right. And all of a sudden, the issue of like drugs coming in through Vancouver or through Arkansas or other places, all of a sudden you're choking the sources. But at the same time, you can't just do it like that. You got to be able to do what JFK was doing, which is let's work with South American leaders and our own to cultivate jobs that are dignified, that are worthwhile. So you don't just get people stuck, doing some less than minimum wage job or underworking like we have today, where they're desperate for cash, they're desperate to pay their bills, and they have to, they find themselves in a situation where to just survive, they got to like do drugs or get into crime or something. So they don't know. It's so misdefined for so many people today, and I think that those intelligent analysts have been deprived of an appreciation of what the hell is behind the growth of. Last thing I'll say, and then I know I rant sometimes, but Ukraine, back in 1991, Ukraine was one of the most powerful, high quality economies of Europe. That's where everybody would go for their vacations. It had a robust industrial base. People had good quality jobs. So yeah, there was Stefan Bandera legacy groups and stuff that were fascist, but it was like Hitler in the 1920s. It was so minuscule and uninfluential and fringe that it didn't play a role in much of anything because people had hope for the future. They had a good life. And then after 30 years of self-induced, or the IMF and the Western financiers created a controlled demolition of the Ukrainian economy, creating a situation that by 2014 was a disaster, and Yanukovych tried to push back against that, but that went the way it did. And the lack of hope, it sunk down to being the bottom country on GDP per capita, the highest corruption by design. It wasn't an accident. People like Jeffrey Sachs understood how this works when he was doing this to Perestroika in Russia. They thought this through. It was not a mistake, as he says, I didn't know what I was doing when I was in Russia working for the IMF and working with Soros. I didn't know. No, you knew exactly what you were doing, and you were not alone. And so with that comes a climate of radicalization. People are more inclined to jump into some weird, neo-Nazi legacy group and become, a drug-laced fanatic, on methamphetamines as a walking killer. That'll happen when, that kid could have been a nuclear engineer in another world, but that's not the world we gave them. Now they're fascist killers with Stefan Bandera tattoos.
And I want to go to something like I was saying that these pundits, this is very pervasive in the so-called alternative media as they beat down the mainstream media. They do a lot of things that is not acceptable. Also, and I don't know if it's conscious or ignorance. I don't know if they're doing it willingly or through ignorance. But they talk about criminality, and they talk about urban America, that is poor black, brown, red, yellow, and red and white people. They talk about people who are and I don't advocate criminality on any level. I think criminal actions should be punished according to the law, but there cannot be two sets of this. How can, on one hand, we be so against a guy stealing a pair of shoes or some food to eat, right? And then we see the criminality of leaders of government investing in Nancy Pelosi, insider trading, and she's rewarded with the speakership. Or we see Joe Biden, criminality in Ukraine, and he's the president, went from vice president to president. We see criminality on levels unheard of. And these people don't go to jail. They don't get demonized in the media. They don't become this villain. It is the poor people who are barely making it that become the villains and the criminals and the convicts, while the people who steal tens of millions, tens of billions, and hundreds of billions of dollars play musical chairs through these think tanks and government organizations. And how is that just? And why are these pundits allowing it? Or if they address it, they only address it if they have a dog in a race. If they're pro-Trump, they'll address it against Biden. If they're pro-Biden, they'll address it against Trump. But I mean, why is it why should it be so concerning to the masses? I'm saying that they have you thinking of this trivial stuff, why people are stealing hundreds of billions of dollars. Like the guy, what is his name? I forget his name. The guy in the crypto, the curly hair guy.
Bankman Fried.
The guy was doing all kind of criminal deeds. They locked him up. They put him away out of the camera after the stuff blew over. And now the guy's out of jail and said he's not facing any charges. Billions and billions of dollars. Yeah. I mean, how is that not criminal? And I'm saying this because, and I'm not harping on Colonel McGregor, but I heard a show that he did the other day. And I'm saying, how is that not criminality? How is that not something that should be on the front burner, and a person going into a store stealing because of necessity? It's criminality. But these people who are wealthy, rich, and powerful are stealing because they have the power to do it, because it's in their grasp, and that's not criminality. I mean, make that make sense.
Man, no, you're asking tough, important questions that should be asked. And I just found out that Justin Trudeau, when he was made, and I don't say elected, but when he was made Prime Minister of Canada, his net worth was $10 million. And today, his net worth is upwards of $320 million. He's got personal connections directly to technologies, lipo nanoparticle technologies that were used in every single jab that was distributed. That oh man, there's so many levels of graft, which is part of I think the on a broad level, the loss of the mandate of heaven. Like we're in a society which has lost the moral fitness to survive, and when you allow this degree of Nero-like, it's really Nero-like corruption. Like Rome, was Rome always destined to collapse? Not necessarily, because when you look at Rome, it wasn't always an empire; it was a republic first, and it was, it had viability when it was still a republic. It could have preserved its moral viability when Cicero was alive. Look at if people had listened to Cicero, he did his own version of Plato's Republic in the form of his Commonwealth or his laws. He did another book that's kind of like Plato's Laws, but it's Cicero's laws. He was a Platonist. He was a devoted student of the Platonic method and Plato, and he was carrying on that tradition as a leading advisor of the government. And people loved him. He was an eloquent, hilarious speaker. He had access to his human sense of humor, humility. He despised injustice, but he was able to work within the system too, which is like making him extra dangerous. He had a lot of bad enemies, and they killed him. Right? Like what happened? He got his own Socrates moment at a certain point when Mark Antony demanded that his head be chopped off and his tongue be stripped out so that Antony could stick it on his wall. But he made the point. If you that and Augustine also made the same point. Actually, Augustine cites Cicero because Augustine is also a Platonic. He's a Platonist. He's writing in Platonic dialogue. St. Augustine at the end of the Roman Empire, and people are wondering, like, well, why is the Roman Empire collapsing? The Visigoths and the hordes are coming in. Everything's on fire. It's like 400, 410 AD. The Western system is collapsing, and Augustine writes his City of God. And in his City of God, he cites Cicero. And he's like, look, Cicero even pointed out that it's not because people are blaming Christianity. They're like, it's because we became Christian. That became the state religion. That's why the gods are punishing us for abandoning them. And so we have to kill the Christians now. And so Augustine's like, well, wait a minute. We were already bad before Christianity even existed. We were already doing bad. We killed Cicero. and he cites Cicero, and Cicero makes the point and Cicero was writing this in like 60 or 56 BC, that Rome lost its moral fitness really with the Second Punic War and the decision to abandon the treaty, the alliance with Carthage, that Rome had before, when Rome was still a republic. For 250 years, Rome had a strategic alliance with Carthage, and they fought wars together. They defended themselves with a common security treaty from the days of like Solon, really. And then something happens inside of Rome's elite, and they stab Carthage in the back, and they start launching wars of aggression against their former ally. They cancel their peace, their alliance. This is kind of like what the United States did. If you think about our friendship with Russia and China, who we fought side by side with to put down the Nazi machine, that was a U.S., Russia, China brotherhood, and we stabbed them in the back. We went empire. It's very similar. The whole Vietnam War was sort of our own version of the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War was the war that saw Athens earlier on in the 300 or so, 399 or a little bit, 420 actually, BC was when Athens had their ally Sparta, that they worked together in the Delian League in defense of a common threat of the Persian hordes of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. They worked together. They had an alliance. They fought brave battles together boldly against this otherwise fascist prospect of world government under these cults and cults within cults that were like the managing structures of, at the time, the Persian Empire that fell quite far from the aspirations of Cyrus the Great. But what happens with Athens? They get some affluence, they get some money, they get some power because they do such a good job. They had such virtue, but all of a sudden they lose it. They get corrupted with all of that abundance. And the new age of the sophists comes out, and they start stabbing their allies in the back. They start declaring war on all of their allies. Sparta, the smaller Delian League countries, all have to start paying tribute to Athens. They start declaring unilateral wars of aggression against their allies, and they lose the moral fitness to survive. Socrates and Plato try to resist that collapse of morality, but it doesn't last long, and ultimately they get what came to them. You fall out of the mandate of heaven. You stop obeying the natural law, which is a moral law as well as a physical, and you will pay the consequences. You will collapse. And the same thing with Cicero. He's like, look, unless we can restore back what we lost when we said Carthage delenda est, and we killed all of the men after they surrendered, all of the men and women, or men and children were killed. The women and children were put into slavery of Carthage, and we didn't accept their surrender even. Unless we can restore back the previous morality that we lost, Cicero is making the point that we're going to become an empire and we're going to die. Like the universe will strike us down at some point because of that choice. And it was a choice. And they killed him, just like they killed Socrates. The Democratic Party of Athens killed Socrates. Keep that in mind. It was a democratic vote that was done in the jury. And so Rome became an empire, and Rome started just crushing morality, crushing the poorest of the people around the outskirts that had to stay poorer and poorer and poorer and fight each other to feed the capital that became decadent with just festivals, right? 230 days of the year of Rome's capitals were festival days of circuses and wine and bread. And so people became too stupid to think about upon what flimsy foundations was the pleasure that they were enjoying. What was it based? It was based on evil, keeping the people on the outskirts enslaved, poor, fighting each other. And so the empire became increasingly unviable. And when it collapsed, it made so many enemies who had so much resentment towards them, who could have been their allies. The Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, all of these other groups, they could have been the allies of Rome if they treated them like honest, natural human beings, but they didn't. So they built up all this animosity. And then all of a sudden you started getting these onslaughts of waves of attacks, right? And you've got drunk, decadent auxiliaries managing the Senate, managing the Praetorian Guard, managing things who are supposed to now be the defenders of Rome. But these are people who themselves are doing like the debauched orgies and shit, and like doing the vomitorium so that they keep drinking. Like that's their culture. So they're not equipped to defend their government. And so, Augustine is also saying, like, look, if we go to Christian principles, we can restore our mandate of heaven and become, we can avoid what's coming onto us now. If we actually act, because right now we're putting on the Christian clothing, but it's still, and Augustine is making the point, inside of a city of God, it's still all pagan. Like it's all the same corrupt pagan mystery schools that have been repackaged and called Christian for political reasons, but we're not acting with love of God, love of our fellow man. We're not acting like Christ. So we're not really Christian. And he's fighting all these different pseudo-Christian sects around him. And Rome doesn't listen to Augustine, and Rome ends up decaying and collapsing from within. So I think we're at that place right now of just like such extreme decadence and corruption that if we have a small window of opportunity to, God willing, rediscover what made us good, what made us possible in the first place. And if we don't, we're going to get what's coming at us, and hopefully the next generation of Americans who maybe it might be several generations that have to be, we might go into a dark age. We might go into a dark age and forget the things we used to know completely. The fact that Russia and China are not decadent or corrupt, there is corruption and decadence within, but that's not what's defining Russia and China today, or many of the countries that have suffered so much under globalization. There's like a real awakening of real statecraft and maturity. Like there are adults in the room. That gives me hope, because now you have potentially the torch of civilization being picked up willfully by real mature human beings who don't want to self-sacrifice. And that gives me some hope that maybe that example, because that example is there, it gives us a reference point to look at, well, what does sanity look like? If that wasn't there, I'd be a lot more depressed. We'd probably not be having this conversation if everything was equally corrupt. We wouldn't be having this conversation. What am I saying? We'd be in our slave colony eating bugs, waiting for our suicide pill.
I'm going to highlight Mehdi again, and I'm going to address something he said up in here. He's a channel member, so I'm making sure that I highlight him. Mehdi said, let's see. Okay. It's one before that. He says, like the Biden administration has. We have broken every treaty and promise we have signed with other countries. How can a leader of any country trust the U.S. to not screw them over? Our country has no honors. Now, everything that you said is right, but it wasn't just Biden. It was all of his predecessors, including Donald Trump, who took the United States out of a age-old nuclear treaty, also an international treaty. So it was his predecessors. And to be honest with you, ask the Indians how trustworthy the United States treaties are. Ask the American Indians how many of those treaties have America lived up to, and you'll get this number right here. So now transitioning to and good questioning, good comments, Mitty. Transitioning to Niger. So on August 5th, or a little bit before August 5th, Niger, the new leadership asked for all Western troops to be removed. All Western troops to be removed. That's Italy, that's France, that's the United States, that's Canada. There's a lot of these other nations that most people don't know have bases in the Sahel and that region over there. Now, this is on the 5th, right after this was asked by the government, the military, and the people of Niger. Paris refused to withdraw its troops from Niger. Now, why is it okay? They are demanding that Russia redeploy its troops from Ukraine back to Russian territory because it's an affront to Ukrainian territorial integrity and sovereignty. Yet France, the United States, Italy, and all of these NATO nations are refusing to remove their troops and exit their bases in Niger. And before you answer that, I was watching something and I didn't know that the degree of theft by France was so great in the last 20 or 30 years. I did not know that the uranium, France was, the uranium was being sold for roughly close to $200 a pop. And Niger was getting no more than $11 per sale. And then 60% of that was kickbacks to the corrupt government that they put into power to maintain, and then you had the 4% or so trickle down to the people. How is that not predatory? How is that not criminal? As Colonel McGregor and others talk about criminality in the United States, how is that not criminal on a stage unlike anything you've ever heard before?
I mean, it's going back to the there's a lot of comeuppance that we're facing, and you brought up some of the simple example of the Native Americans, which I think touches on this in some ways, because there's so much abuse and lies and manipulation to the Native American community of North America and Central and South America, for that matter, by the colonial powers that came in over the centuries, and part of there was a fight. You know, like when you read Benjamin Franklin's writings and you look at his works on the need to respect the different native tribes, to not stab them in the back the way the British had done so much, but to treat them differently, to treat them like actual respectful human beings, and to give them and share with them the best of what the West has been able to develop, while at the same time not smothering them or forcing onto them what we demand that they be, but to respect that's the challenge for everybody. Every major civilization, when encountering weaker civilizational groupings, is the challenge of do you have the moral integrity and creative vitality to treat them as they deserve to be treated, while at the same time offering them the good that we can offer them, right? So like running water, innovations in agriculture. Look at what China's doing for I think the Uyghurs, or like actually, here's a good example. The way that China deals with minority groups in China, whether the Tibetan or Uyghurs, ignore what the CIA has been telling us they're doing, but actually let's just look at what they're doing and their approach. Have we seen the language groups that were of Xinjiang disappeared? Do we see those languages disappeared? Or the Buddhist traditions of Tibet, or the language groups of Tibet, have they been crushed? No. We see that they are being taught, even in the modern school systems of West and South China. The traditional garbs, the dances, there's community centers that are bustling, thriving, as well as high-speed rail. And you get a better internet connection in Tibet than you get in Montreal, Canada, unfortunately. So their technique and technology is one thing. The spirit of the people is another thing. And they have to you have to respect the spirit of the people and their distinct identities, while at the same time, if there's something that, is a new technique that we've discovered that we can help you with, we'll help you develop water desalination. It's a technique. You deserve to know it, right? Like, or nuclear power. Like, the atom is the atom. We're all made up of atoms. What, you're going to say that's only like a Western tradition, atomic power? That's why Africans, not part of their culture matrix, that they shouldn't access nuclear power, because that's what the West does. It's like they're all made of atoms. If they had the knowledge of how the atom works, they would discover that when you split off heavy fissile atoms, some of that what was material in the atomic mass disappears and becomes energy, that if you can harness that and put it to work, you can make abundant electricity. You can desalinate mass water. Do you not think that people in Africa would not like to have air conditioning and refrigeration and clean water? Is that not something that they would like to have and make better? Of course, everybody would like that. They don't, and then we're told, but that would be infringing on their way of doing things, their way of life, because they like walking 12 kilometers every day to a dirty well to carry it back to their kids. And they like that. They would prefer that. And I've actually heard these racist anthropologists acting like virtue signalers, saying shit like that. Like if you took a vote of the people living in Central African Republic who only knew that way of life, if you asked them to vote, do you want nuclear energy, or water produced by desalination or something, they would say no. They would prefer to do things their way. That's true, because they just don't know that this other thing exists. They've never seen a light bulb. Like, of course they would vote to walk 12 miles a day to a dirty well, of course, because they don't know anything else. But if you could actually show them that there's another way, they would absolutely vote for that. They would want to learn how to make that happen. So we've been all fed this very imperialism, I think, in today's neo-colonial form, that's a little bit more difficult to see than the old days of African slave trades in North America. It was easier because you're like, there's the slave. It's the person being whipped, by the head slave, controlled by master in the house. That's the slave. You bought them. You got the deed. Today, it's people who have been suffering from a positivist educational thinking, who only believe that truth is from what their senses show them, and they're like, well, I don't see too much official slavery. Or look at Africa, like these kids in the cobalt mines. Yeah, it's too bad, but they don't have the same type of enlightened workers protection, but they're still getting paid 20 cents a day. So because they're getting paid, now all of a sudden they're not a slave. It's like, but why are they kids working in the mine, and why are we only paying them 20 cents a day? And why are we? So all of these questions are just like put in the garbage, because you're like, but we're paying them, so it's not slavery. And now you can go back to sleep and just enjoy your dollar store, And people they just stop thinking about how our whole world has been rewired to be dependent upon increasing rates of poverty from actual people in slavery conditions. And there's an act of will. It's not just that we're stupid. There's an act of will to be stupid, because we don't want to see the truth in some ways, because it would force us, I think, there's a subjective element. It would force people to then look within themselves to change themselves and change the world, which might make their lives difficult, make their jobs hard, might make their life hard. So there's a desire to hold on to the official big stories that are all, nice. and make us feel all good inside. But the reality is what it is, and like you said, I think the way to look at China versus the China example towards Africa is a really good case study to compare to, in contrast to what the French, the Belgian, especially the Anglo-American cartels have done to Africa, because China, they're now what, $200 billion of trade per year now is between China and Africa. That's a huge leap from what it was 25 years ago, which is like $3 billion. That's $200 billion. The U.S. is down to less than $70 billion. The global Chinese Belt and Road Initiative investments, 39% of the global Chinese Belt and Road Initiative investments outside of China are in sub-Saharan Africa specifically. That's an important factor in, I think, a lot of what's going on. I think the fastest growing regions are Namibia, Eritrea, Tanzania. Niger is a big one. I mean, the amount of uranium and other valuable resources in Niger is huge. The fact that the people of Niger, are very much in favor of the coup, and the people in Nigeria, where the government of Nigeria, the puppet dictator there, has literally said we should go in militarily into Niger to reimpose the ousted leader. Was his name Bazoum or something? I got it written down here somewhere. Yeah, Bazoum. That's insane, because this leader is supposed to represent the people of Nigeria, and the people of Nigeria next door are actually 78% of the people polled are all for the current coup that happened in Niger. Because frankly, they know they're not being represented by their government, and they would kind of like to have an actual representative government who cares about them and doesn't want to just work as peons for Western corporations in Nigeria. And so you got this whole interesting phenomenon where, because of the presence of Russia and China, Russia especially militarily, they've provided a sphere of military intelligence that has been unprecedented before 2015, when they went out into Syria to block the regime change there. Russia's presence in Africa, supporting actual authentic governments of Africa against insurgencies that are often Western funded through proxy groups. Tigray People's Liberation Army is just one of many. The Boko Haram in Mali is but one of many CIA groups, offshoots of Al-Qaeda in the case of Boko Haram, used for the purpose of destabilizing target governments that are not behaving the way you want them to. But now Russia is going in, China is going in, offering the military support needed for these governments to protect themselves, to put down these insurgencies. China's going in, actually offering investments into the real economy, building industrial corridors, factories. And so, yeah, they're benefiting by accessing now vital resources that they need. Of course, they're not angels, but it's good common sense business that we should have been doing in the West, and we would be doing if we hadn't sabotaged the JFK program for his approach to relations with Kwame Nkrumah and Lumumba and many other Pan-African leaders who were all either murdered or overthrown in coup d'etats launched by the same CIA that killed JFK. Because JFK was actually helping to build the Volta River Dam in Ghana, the biggest hydroelectric dam in Africa's history up until the current Renaissance Dam of Ethiopia. That was the biggest. Was JFK was the guy who pioneered and helped build this thing in the first place as a stepping stone to what was supposed to be an industrial renaissance for all of Africa under a Pan-African. And keep in mind, Nasser is active as well in Egypt, leading a pan-Arab revival as well around industrial development, new scientific discoveries, working together, avoiding divide to conquer trappings, creating economic abundance and affluence, working with Russia, with China, hopefully working with the United States. That was the dynamic of the 60s that was overthrown by a lot of murder by the CIA and MI6. So now we're seeing a revival of that in a new Pan-African sort of garb. It's exciting that the Mali and the Burkina Faso governments, who've also been through their own coups, have leaders who I've listened to their speeches now, and I'm impressed. I sense some Thomas Sankara, and especially the young leader of Burkina Faso.
Yeah,
solid stuff, and they all have signed like a military pact to defend Niger if there's any type of stupid onslaught from the West or their proxies at ECOWAS. So it's a different paradigm, and I think because of Russia and especially China, who have created such a sphere of protection in a sense, there's so much more to work with for many of these African leaders who wanted to do good, but because they had nothing to work with, they were forced. Like you got Museveni of Uganda. He did some terrible things in his day, but I'm seeing like he's recognized. He's like an older statesman who's been there for like 30 years, and he's like now recognizing that holy shit, finally there's a way to get out of the trap. And the fact that he played the game, I think that's not so great that he played the game the way he did. But the fact that he's now actually making some serious moves to bring Uganda into that Eurasian multipolar space in a very with an anti-imperial understanding, alongside other African leaders who are all emerging saying the same sort of thing, because now they feel safe to speak what they couldn't say before, is very important. So again, yeah, France asked to be part of the South African BRICS summit coming up. Honestly, I think that they should be allowed to attend and be put in a penalty box, but at the same time, for like a few decades. But they should never be allowed to be members of the BRICS if that's what anybody in France wants to think. But France has shown that there's at least a certain grouping within the French establishment who sees that they're being sabotaged by the Anglo-Americans, and they're being flushed. They are being flushed. And that, I think, has a lot to do with some of what the business community, who are all told that they have to die now, like Total, all like the entire industrial base is being told, okay, Green New Deal, everybody's going to eat bugs. We're not going to have oil. We're going to shut down nuclear power. And they like pulled Macron and carried him to China, like not that long ago, and told him like, be nice, make deals, and break with the NATO policy. And so since then, France has been sort of walking in two worlds in a sense, that's why Japan ended up not following through on the plan to install a NATO liaison base in Japan, which was supposed to happen this week. It was because France intervened and vetoed it, saying no. And France signed dozens of economic deals with China and settled natural gas purchases with Chinese yuan. But I think that there's that element of messiness in it too. So it's not like France is evil because of this, but they have done evil, and they are suffering from the evil that they have done. But at the same time, there's this other France that's also been there, which actually is a bit more self-aware of their self-interest and knows that they have no role to play in the new world order that's coming on, that are trying to sort of like figure out ways of surviving. You saw the same thing in Saudi Arabia in its own way, right? With the transformation into sanity from the Saudi leadership, which was behaving very badly for so long. And now all of a sudden it started changing its character because they realized they had no fundamental security within the New World Order that they were promised that they were going to be leaders of, or at least have a jurisdiction within. They're like, no, actually, we're a lot more Saddam Hussein-like than we thought. So I think the same sort of thing is going to be happening more and more to other corrupt players who might have a chance to rediscover what made them once good and learn how to rebehave according to some morality over a long time. Penalty box. They should be in the penalty box for many, many years before they're allowed to have any part. They should be allowed to invest in Belt and Road projects. They should be allowed to do that, I think. Or African development projects initiated, by the Pan-African movement. They should be allowed to invest and maybe, have investors get returns for good things that are built, but they should have no role to play in deciding what those investments are or how they work or anything like that. They should just be allowed to be there as an observer, and maybe learn how to behave again.
Mehdi says, and I know what this is for. He says it's like some guy down the street deciding to park there in your living room uninvited and is eating everything in your fridge. That is Western foreign policy. Now, speaking of that, there's a few more questions. He's been generous with his time. There are a few more questions I want to ask you, but I want
to at 2:00. I gotta jump into another interview. So we have to.
Okay. Just so check this out. As you were talking, I was doing the math. We'll just say $288. I believe it was between $288 to $300 that France was selling the uranium at, and Niger was getting $11. That's 3%. That is your country produces the resources and you only get 3%. And of that 3%, the nation only gets 40% because 60% of it is kickbacks to the leaders. This is outrageous. And I want to give people an understanding of what I'm talking about. The size of Niger, because these maps make it look small. Niger is almost twice the size of the state of Texas. That gives you an idea of just how big that country is. Now, I want you in closing to talk about China, but I want to preface it with this because the United States always talks about confronting China. The West says that China is being belligerent. China is threatening the rules-based international order. While we know that is the mantra or that is the theme coming out of the West, China has lifted 850 million people out of poverty. That is equivalent to almost the entire population of Europe and the United States together. So instead of them being belligerent, shouldn't they take the smart person would say, how did they do this? And then try to extract the information from that to lift their own smaller populations out of that same quagmire. What say you, and where do you think this is leading between the United States and China?
Well, you're right. Once again, I mean, your observations are astute and solid, and the human response to such an incredible achievement should be, how do they do it? What can we learn from that? The unhuman response is, how can we destroy such a threat? I mean, what is that? Because, I mean, at the end of the day, it's not capitalism, and people, again, try to reduce this whole thing to like some capitalist communist dialectic. And it's not that at all. It's so much more rich than that, because this fight was going on far before the days of the Cold War. These are just Cold War tropes that were like put onto us that we like were expected to fit into as a mold. But this is a fight, like, I've been alluding to this. It goes back thousands of years. It's a continuous struggle. And before Karl Marx was born and before Adam Smith was born, and you'll find that there are the type of capitalism that especially emerged out of 1971 and the creation of Davos, which itself was created out of as a junior partner to the Bilderberger Group, a slightly older pseudo-capitalist, globalist organization set up by Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. That thing that we were told was capitalism, that became known as globalization, that became the rules-based order, was never capitalism. It was just feudalism with a capitalist veneer, but it was always fundamentally feudalism in its essence. Real capitalism involves the creation of capital. It involves creation. It's not just consumption. It's not just extraction of wealth. And that's the way that value is defined under this feudal capitalist system. And that could include also the British East India Company's variety of capitalism that they were promoting to India and to Ireland and to Africa and to the world for so long, which itself was crafted in the bowels of the city of London, which itself was part of the takeover of the Venetian party inside of London that had managed the takeover of what was formerly a viable British or English land, of the land of Shakespeare, Thomas More, an anti-imperial land of people like Erasmus, who were leaders of this thing, Henry VII, the great king who established one of the first nation-state systems based on an idea of natural law. That was viable, but that had to be purged and overthrown in favor of transforming the character of England into becoming an empire, which is what happened, especially with the 1688 Glorious Revolution that saw a puppet dictator brought in from the Netherlands as part of that was the Glorious Revolution, and from there a re-empowerment of the city of London financiers and leading families, who were then able to coalesce and converge around this new beast that then established the Bank of England as the world's second private central bank, that then interfaced with a private corporation called the British East India Company. That was it was a corporatist global empire. And so the idea of value within that empire was based on extraction of rents of labor. So like that was valuable. Like how much more profit could an entrepreneur make was based upon how many slaves he put to work or how many workers he forced to work longer hours. But there was no qualitative idea of improving the powers of labor through new discoveries. That wasn't allowed in the British system of value. You could speculate, you could gamble,
on what you think the commodity prices would be in the future and make money on things like the South Sea bubble, or the earlier Dutch tulip bubble, or there's many bubbles that are tied to gambling principles, not creating anything real but gambling. So that was permitted. You could do war profiteering, that was permitted, but the actual none of those ideas of value have any authenticity to them. They're all destructive. They're all negative value in action. So the actual viable capitalism is based on creating abundance, recognizing that we're going to create better business when we have peace than if we have war, because we're not going to kill our clients. We're not going to kill our customers. We're going to end poverty because we know that by having people who are industrializing and living longer, healthier lives, they will consume more of our products, and we will be able to consume and purchase quality products that they make. Right? It's better common sense. It's not angelic, because people would hear some of what I'm saying and they would be like, and I get this a lot. They're like, that's utopian. That's the world. It can't be run by angels that way. It's like, no, this is common. This is true self-interest. We've been living under such an insane world that's been normalized of bad self-interest that we don't know what reality is anymore. We don't know what a natural reference point to healthy business looks like. And then people say, oh, that that involves moral values. Well, if moral values are governing the behavior of economic investments, well, then isn't that socialism? Isn't that socialism if you have social principles animating morally the behavior of money and investment strategies? Isn't that socialism? And doesn't it? Well, no, because there again, there's not one socialism, just like there's not one capitalism. What Lincoln was doing doesn't fit under any model of modern capitalism. What you'll find that there's feudal socialists who actually, like I mentioned, Bertrand Russell, H.G. Wells, they're socialists. The Fabian Society is a socialist organization. It caters to the disenfranchised, the alienated, the abused. That's how it works. But the people running it hate people. They hate the people that they profess that they want to defend. But how do they see the people? Well, they see them as weaponized mobs that could be used to overthrow governments you don't like, or to support a policy of self-control that would otherwise enslave them. That's the type of sort of socialism of the Fabian Society ilk, or the Trotskyists, I think, also were of that sort of ilk as well. Now, you also have socialists who you can work with. Kwame Nkrumah identified himself as a socialist. Was Kwame Nkrumah a Fabian? He loved people. He didn't believe in overpopulation. He believed that it was through cultivating the powers of discovery in our people and pulling people out of poverty that you could attain liberty. He was an anti-imperialist, and he really was. He died for that. He was pro-development, pro-industry. Was he against private ownership? No. But he believed in social values, and he believed in the government playing a role in doing things. Does that make you socialist? No. The whole oligarchy has been trying for centuries to destroy the sovereign nation state, because the sovereign nation state can do things in defense of the people, by the people, and for the people's interests against the oligarchy, who would rather everything be run by a private financier class. And any type of sovereign nation state that the oligarchy would like to permit exist has to simply be taken over and controlled by and used as a tool by said oligarchy, and not for or by or of the people. That's a different. So that's not the same kind of nation state as what we're defending, right? That's why they want ultimately world government with sub-nations in name only to manage the slaves. That's what they did for Africa. You think that a lot of the countries of Africa are sovereign countries, just like people think Ukraine is a sovereign country. No, they were wired to be organized corruption, obedient to a force outside of their country in order to manage the local slave extraction. So that's what the world order has been under the British Empire, and since the day especially of Franklin Roosevelt's early death and the launching of the bombs that Roosevelt never would have permitted, and the purging of America of its patriots once Roosevelt was dead. All of the allies who understood the Wall Street, London, Fabian Society, Rhodes Scholar parasite growing as a deep state in their midst, they were purged, called red commies, and they lost everything. Some were killed. JFK tried to revive the spirit in a good way a few years later, but that didn't last long. His brother tried to revive it again in 1968. That didn't last long. I do think that Trump actually is a mixed bag, but I don't think that I would categorize him as a evil technocratic board, because he did too many things in my mind that disrupted the overarching depopulation agenda that I know that the oligarchy is committed to. So I'm not against Trump, but I do think he's stupid in ways that are frustrating. But I don't think of him in the same level as, let's say, a George Bush or a Dick Cheney or an Obama or a Biden. I wouldn't categorize him in that from my standpoint. But I think that's why the oligarchy was so fanatically obsessed with ensuring that he was not able to do anything under 4 years of Russiagate, make believe and stuff. Where the other possibility was extracting the U.S. from NATO commitments, working with Russia as he said he would, and I believe he was going to, working with China on the U.S.-China trade deal to create a sort of healthy basis of win-win cooperation. I think that those were the things that we were moving in, which is why that all had to be stopped in what happened. Which I know that this might be streamed to YouTube, so I don't want to say anything that might get this taken down from YouTube, so I won't. But all that to say, the oligarchy would benefit immensely by allowing development and ending poverty. That's good friggin' business. China is doing good business, but it's also moral. It's not just pragmatic. It's also tied to a sense of natural law, or as the Chinese call it, the mandate of heaven, the Confucian principle that we have to abide by the structure of law embedded in creation itself. Very similar to what Augustine was talking about with natural law within the Christian matrix. Same idea. So there is a positive virtue, as well as something that appeals to the pragmatists out there who want to make money and just get by. It's good on every level to end poverty, end wars, work on. There's other challenges. The universe is always going to throw challenges at us: earthquakes and asteroids and solar flares that can knock out our electricity grid. Like, those are real issues that are always going to be there. We could be putting our powers to solving real issues instead of the ones we make for ourselves by tolerating oligarchs who have to light fires and get us to fight each other. Those are artificial problems. We shouldn't have to deal with those. If we're a mature species, we should be able to think about the real problems.
Now, in closing, thank you, Matt. I got to get you back on the platform again soon.
Oh, sure, man.
Got to get you back on the platform. I know the time is limited. You only have a few minutes to get in between this and your next interview, so you can drop off the air, and I'll hit you up later. And be blessed, man. Give your wife my love. Be blessed, and stay safe.
Yeah, man. You too. All right. Bye. And bye, everybody who's watching live.
Okay. All right, man. Thank you. Everybody who's watching, thank you all for joining. Now, I want to say a few things in parting. We were supposed to have Scott Ritter on the show. I didn't announce it. The last week or so of July, and we were supposed to have him sometime. I think it was I'm sorry. This thing is bothering me for a second. We were supposed to also have him on I think the 4th or the 5th of August. And what's happening is, now I have to call Scott now. What's happening is that Yahoo and Gmail are sending Scott and my responses to each other to spam. I've been missing Scott's contact, and something just told me to contact him the other day, and I'm like, man, I missed like 8 or 9 communiques with Scott. We're also supposed to be having Alyssa. We're supposed to have Scott. We're going to have a few more guests on. We're supposed to have international podcast host, international pundit and geopolitical analyst, Causal. He is also a person that is on. He frequents a lot of channels like RT and all that. We're just trying to get a time frame because he's, I think, in Bali or whatever. So we're trying to get a time frame going for us to have him on. I told you I'm trying to bring you guys the best, and I'm trying to give you all every avenue to get information from. And I want to do it in a way that's comfortable for you and that's informative for you. Now, if I get back in time, we'll do a live stream later on. Listen, if I get back in time, we'll do a live stream later. I have a few things I have to take care of. Life is on the outside of the podcast also. So I just want to thank each and every one of you for giving me your time. As I often say in closing, that time is the greatest commodity ever. Why? Because it's an unrenewable commodity. And once it is used up, you can never get it back. So when you give your time to someone or something, make sure that you get an equal or greater return for your time. And I hope and pray that this show has given you somewhat of an equal and even a greater return for your listening, for your watching, for your participation, and for your time. On that note, I go out the same way I came in, with love in my heart for each and every one of you who love truth. But know that the true and living God, he will always love you better. Until we next speak again, stay strong, stay true, but above all things, stay righteous. Hey, mama, your baby boy loves you more than life. And before I go off, everybody, give a shout out to my brother John Legs, my brother Chris Legs, my sister Charlotte Legs, my sister Shalita Legs, my sister Charmaine Legs, my sister LaShandria Legs, and my of course my mother, of course. And shout out to my pops, rest in peace, John Legs. And I just want everybody in my family to know that I love you. Let us grow together. And for everybody who's listening, before I go off there, know this, that if you know better, do better by people. Because ultimately, you don't have to answer to them. You have to answer to the ultimate judge, and that is God in person. Mama, you know I love you. Everybody deuces, I'm out.